Yeah, welcome in. Welcome back to another episode of the Format Podcast. Got a pretty decent show for you here today. Even though it's football season, definitely gonna get into an interesting NBA topic that I just think is definitely needs discussion. It's pretty interesting. Seems like Steph Curry's been in the NBA news a lot lately. I guess that's good for him because it shows that people are really thinking about him and shows what a tremendous player he's been for his era, and I guess historically with the things that he's done. But before we go ahead and get to that, you know what time it is. If you haven't already, please go ahead, click that like, subscribe, and that notification bell right here on YouTube so you can be made aware whenever new content comes out on the channel. We appreciate that. If you want the audio only version of the podcast, open up your audio podcast platform, type in the Format Podcast in the search bar. We should come right up. So you know what to do there. Share the pod if you know you like it. Share the pod with other people you know who want to hear a different sports voice and a different take on things than you might hear on the normal channels. And you know what happens when you do this? Helps us find more sports fans, helps more sports fans find us. Now let's get right to it. Okay, so let me make this clear before I start, because a lot of times in the modern sports media landscape, when you're objective about anything, you get called a hater, right? If you don't worship somebody, you're a hater. If you're objective and you maybe come from a different generation, you're an old head. So you combine them two, you're an old head hater. But that's not the case here. I'm going to try to play it down the middle on this, but let me make it clear before we even start. I love Steph Curry. I am a huge, huge fan of Steph Curry. I think he's an absolutely phenomenal player. Arguably one of the greatest shooters of all time. Some people say that he's without a doubt the greatest shooter of all time. You could argue that. There are other guys who definitely could be in that argument, but in terms of what he can do off the dribble, in terms of his range, in terms of what he can do in the catch and shoot game, there's a fair argument that he is the greatest shooter of all time. And then, of course, on the volume piece of it, you know, being having the most made 3-pointers in NBA history, all that stuff adds up. Now, you got to be real. Pace of play, the way the game is played, and let's be real, he is a huge part of the way the game is played. He's a huge part of the shift to that. But the way the game is played today, the pace of play, the way the rules are instituted, all that has helped to lend to his amazing achievements as a shooter in the game and his statistical accomplishments. Now, that said, the way the rules are and all that stuff has also helped to lend a great deal to the statistical accomplishments of many players. And they're not all doing what he's done. So credit where credit's due. But anyway, there's been a lot of talk about Steph Curry lately. There's been, and I did a show about this maybe a week or two ago, Steph Curry versus Magic Johnson, who's the greatest point guard of all time. Y'all know my thoughts on that. Don't even believe Steph Curry's actually a point guard. It's Magic Johnson, and I don't ever see anyone being a better point guard than him, just in terms of what a point guard is supposed to do: run the team, distribute the basketball, etc. But you can check out the show that we did on that if you're curious to know my thoughts on who's the greatest point guard of all time and why. So here's the most recent thing, right? There were some comments from Charles Barkley on the Bill Simmons podcast regarding Steph Curry and feeling like Steph may not have been able to survive physically in the 80s and 90s and the way the game was played back then. So let's check out those comments. We'll come back and then we'll talk about it, and then we'll also mix in some comments from former NBA Vice President Stu Jackson and some thoughts of his on how the game has changed, et cetera, and we'll get to it. So check out these thoughts, and we'll get back and check those out and discuss them.
I have to admit, it's a lot easier to play basketball nowadays because you can't hit anybody. As much as I love Steph Curry, and I love Steph Curry, can you imagine if the bad boys was beating the hell out of him? Bill, can you imagine that? As much as I love Steph Curry, if you think that he could take those blows that John Sally, Dennis Rodman, Bill Laimbeer, those body checks that they were putting on Michael and Scotty and myself and guys like that, you really think Steph Curry wouldn't break?
Well, I think one thing that your era doesn't get credit for when they start comparing everything, and there's like, well, LeBron played 20 years. It's such a better career than Jordan. You know, there's all this stuff that can allow people to play that long. You know, if Steph had come in the 80s, his ankles would have ruined his career in 6 years, you know?
Okay, so those were some pretty interesting comments from Charles Barkley, one of the greatest players of all time, who really doesn't get that due because he didn't win a championship. And he understands that. But if you were around to have seen Charles Barkley play, that dude was amazing. He was a hell of a player at only 6'5", playing the power forward position. He was absolutely incredible. But this isn't about Charles Barkley. This is about the fact that there is some truth to what Charles Barkley said. And it's not to say that, I mean, of course, I'm sure he's going to get called an old head hater and all that, right? But the fact is this: Steph Curry doesn't have a career the length that he's had. He may not have been able to get through his early career ankle injuries back then, because remember, his career started first few years, he had serious ankle injuries that he was able to rehab through and get back and work his way into the incredible all-time great player that he is today. He may not have been able to get through that due to the physicality of the game back then, especially at the point guard position. We know, and this is something I've spoken of constantly with other people, when it comes to Steph Curry, the range with which he can shoot the three puts stresses on defenses that basketball defenses were never designed to encounter. So there's that. However, if he played back then, that would have been somewhat negated by his own coaching. And why do I say that? Because back then, you weren't allowed to just pull up and take 35-foot threes unless, maybe end of a quarter, end of a half, end of a game, right? Desperation Eve. But coaches wouldn't have allowed him to just come across half court and pull up from wherever he wanted. Coaches weren't allowing guys back then to take 10, 15, 23s in a game. That just wasn't going to happen, right? You play within the flow of the offense as well. You play to try and get a more high percentage shot, right? Which is generally closer to the rim, makes more sense. Even as great a shooter as Steph is, I believe a career 43% three-point shooter, the fact is if you're closer to the rim, the shot will be higher percentage. Like, that's just logic, right? So anyway, he wouldn't have gotten all those shots, right? So here's the thing: when we start talking about it, people are going to say, well, Isaiah Thomas was a small guard. He was smaller than Steph Curry. I think Steph is 6'3", Isaiah was 6'1". They're going to say that. But here's the difference, right? Isaiah Thomas grew up hooping in the hood in Chicago on those blacktops. You think Isaiah Thomas wasn't getting beat up physically back then? Like, he grew up playing in a way that physically prepared him for the rigors of big-time Division I college basketball, and then the physical rigors of the NBA. So he was already well-conditioned for that. Now, who's to say that if Steph grew up in that era, he wouldn't have been more physically conditioned for that? Maybe, but we don't know. We're just going based on what we've seen and the type of player that he is now and the type of player that he's been throughout his career. Here's the other thing. Steph Curry, as great as he is, that era was so much more defensive oriented, especially at the guard position. Most of the time as a point guard, you weren't, especially if you were really good, guys weren't just going to let you bring the ball up 3/4 court and then initiate the offense. That usually didn't happen. Think about, you got a guy like Muggsy Bogues or Spud Webb, or moving forward, Isaiah Thomas or Gary Payton, the glove, right? Mookie Blaylock, a whole bunch of elite defenders at the point guard position. So those guys pressuring you half court, 3/4 court constantly. All that stuff saps your energy at the point guard position. So Steph is one of the most finely conditioned athletes arguably ever seen in the NBA. No question about that. But that's because there's not nearly as much defensive pressure on the ball, and because he's not usually the initiator of offense in Golden State. That's usually Draymond. So now he's running a more traditional point guard role, as he would be expected to do back then. So he's getting pressured by all these guys, right? That takes away some of your legs. And then we talk about how great he is off the ball, how much he can run the baseline and do all those great cuts and get free, and all that is great, except for the fact that back then you're running the baseline and you're running the cuts. The defenders, even if they're getting picked off, they may stick a leg out and you get kneed in the thigh, or you catch an elbow running the baseline, or you catch a shoulder. All that stuff slows you down. All that stuff wears on you. Everything back then was not in the pick and roll looking for a mismatch, right? All those things wear on you, and it slows you down, and it puts a physical pounding on you, right? Steph is a great finisher at the rim now, okay? So back then, we know they weren't allowing layups, right? Steph is not going to go to the rim and dunk on you. He's not Derrick Rose. He's not Ja Morant. And who knows if even those dudes back then were going to the rim and dunking on guys when you had, the 6'10" Davis boys, or you had Olajuwon, or you had David Robinson and Patrick Ewing and Charles Oakley and Karl Malone. I don't need to go down the list, but you had so many legitimate bigs and crowded paints, right? Steph he's already mastered the floater, but he'd been shooting that thing a whole lot more because he's not getting all the way to the rim back then. So all these things play a role in production. They play a role in the physicality and what a player is going to be able to do based on that, right? So a lot of the free release, a lot of the open shots, and all those things that Steph Curry gets today, he wouldn't get back then. And again, what you got Barkley talking about, the physicality of the bad boy Pistons, literally putting guys on the ground, right? The physicality of those early '90s Knicks, coached by Pat Riley, really a whole bunch of great defensive teams. Even the Celtics from back then, those guys all knew. The Celtics from the mid to late '80s, everybody knew, like, you weren't giving up dunks, you weren't giving up layups easy at the rim. Like, so much of basketball, don't get me wrong, players today are skilled, but part of it is they're skilled because it's so much easier. It's so much less physical. Everything is opened up and it's made for the offensive proliferation. Like, you've heard me talk about this constantly. So what I'm going to do real quick, I'm going to quote former NBA Vice President Stu Jackson here. And he says the new rules were designed to make penetration easier, among other things, right? So Stu Jackson said, and I want to say this is some years ago, right? He says, with the rule and interpretation changes, it has become more difficult. It has become more difficult for defenders to defend penetration, cover the entire floor on defensive rotations, and recover to shooters. This has provided more time for shooters to ready themselves for quality shots. With more dribble penetration, ball handlers are getting more opportunities at the rim. So, literally, they changed the rules to make it easier for offense. They literally changed the rules to make it easier for offense. If you didn't get that, let me read it to you again. With the rule and interpretation changes, it has become more difficult for defenders to defend penetration, cover the entire floor on defensive rotations, and recover to shooters. This has provided more time for shooters to ready themselves for quality shots. With more dribble penetration, ball handlers are getting more opportunities at the rim. So they literally made it easier for guys to score, for guys to shoot, for guys to get to the rim. And then, of course, with the way the game has changed and you have no more traditional power forwards, you have very few traditional shot blocking centers. And even if you do, everything is the pick and roll game now to try and get them away from the basket. And you have a whole bunch of centers now that shoot the three. So the traditional shot blocking center is having a harder time staying close to the basket and doing their job. Everything has been made easier. And so I say that as great as Steph Curry is, and he is all time great, he plays in an era where things have been made easier for him. And so this is the stuff Charles Barkley is talking about. Steph Curry has never had to and will never have to deal with the things that he had to deal with, right? It's the same thing, the analogy that I made. If I ran a 10 flat 100 meters, obviously I never ran a 10 flat 100 meters, but if I ran a 10 flat 100 meters, right? And then 10 years later, somebody came and ran a 9.7 100 meters, blew my record away by 3/10 of a second, right? Which is crazy in track. But I ran my 10.0 100 meters uphill. Is that person really that much faster than me? Or are they running with a concerted advantage? These are the things we got to think about. And again, I'm not an old head hater, but I love Steph Curry. I do. But at the same time, I can acknowledge that he's playing in a situation which allows for him to do the things he's doing. Now, of course, he's going to be smart and take advantage of that. Who wouldn't? But we got to be real here, and we got to look at both sides of the thing. So what I want to know from you, do you think Charles Barkley's right when he says that Steph Curry would break if he played back then against those physical defenses such as the Pistons and the Knicks? Would he still be a great player? I think he'd still be a great player. Or would he just not be as great as he is in the modern NBA? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. Get at me. Can't wait to hear it. Can't wait to do another show, and can't wait to respond to those. All right. So thank you. I'll be back on the next episode, and I'm out. Peace.